and he asked me instead if I would want to preach in church. I actually really love to preach, so it was something that I was happy to say yes to, and it's a joy to be here with y'all. And I was going to speak originally more to my transition into the job that I'm going to be doing next. My sermon's not going to focus on that, but I do want to start out just by acknowledging that I've left Kenya in terms of living there. So many of you know I was working in Kenya as a missionary, and I was running an organization called Tatua, which was offering solutions for poverty that had to deal with building up the community on the ground's capacity to deal with poverty. And unfortunately, there's been some growing instability in the country. And it's not at a point right now where it was imminent for me to leave, but the church felt like that if the violence increased, the government wouldn't have the capacity to deal with it. So they made the decision to ask me to leave earlier rather than later. And so now I'm back in the U.S. full-time, and I've been awarded a partially funded fellowship to look at how the church is going through a period of renewal, how there are spiritual communities that are really asking how in today's world do we build community in which people can know God and live it out in their world. Like y'all do through the Pumpkin Patch and through LDI, and really using my work and my skills to build a story of how the church is shifting. So I'll be around and you'll see me now doing that. And I'm really excited about that work. I have to be honest that I'm very thrilled about what I'm doing. It's sad to have left Kenya, but it feels very good to be stepping into this next phase of my life. And I thought I was going to get to talk about that work, but on Wednesday night, when President Obama announced that the U.S. was making a decision to begin airstrikes on ISIS, I found myself very troubled, and perhaps some of y'all did, and heard that news also, about how do we respond to that as Christians? And how do we respond to the fact that once again the U.S. is going to be engaging in violence? And for those of you who didn't watch his speech on Wednesday, he announced that because of the violence that ISIS is engaging in, that the U.S. was going to be taking a strategy that involves 4 courses of action. 1, to begin airstrikes, to try to end and destroy all of ISIS's actions. And 2, to build up the capacity of the Arab nations to deal with it. 3, to provide support to troops on the ground to protect their countries. And 4, to provide humanitarian aid to people who have been affected by the violence in their countries. And as I prepared for the sermon today, I was struck by how the gospel reading and the Old Testament readings provide seemingly 2 contrasting ideas to how God has dealt with wrong. In the Old Testament, we hear of a God who, frustrated with the violence of the Egyptians, decides to destroy the whole country. And in the Gospel reading, we hear of Jesus, who, once Peter asked how many times do we forgive him, he goes into a story about you're not only supposed to forgive 7 times, but 77, and then talking about how a slave was forgiven all of his sins. And those 2 viewpoints can be heard on the radios today. You hear the voices crying out to destroy all forms of Islam. And you hear people who have made posters, make peace, not war, make love, not war, peace always. And we have to struggle as Christians is how do we respond to this? And I want to offer a response that, in my opinion, is a middle way. It's one where we acknowledge the evil that's being done in the world, but we choose to respond in love. And that response for me starts with acknowledging that the violence that's being perpetrated because of the ISIS community is wrong. That like the Egyptians, they are oppressors. That people have been forced to flee their homelands, sacred spaces are being destroyed, lives are being lost. And that is in contradiction to the God we know. But also, despite that violence, which is incredibly hard for us to fathom, there is space for forgiveness. And I think that comes in looking at what Jesus is saying, not as a cry or a call for us to forgive each episode, each action, but rather to understand that forgiveness is a way of being in our world. And for me, that's most easily understood through a story. When I was a young girl, some of you may know that my father spent most of my life unemployed. So from the time I was 3 to currently, he has not held a job. And when I was 18, I made a decision to forgive my dad. It's a very self-righteous decision. I decided that I had completely forgiven him for anything he had ever done, and I could get over the fact that he was unemployed. But then, at 25, he did something else. He decided not to like the boyfriend I was dating, and that I could not get over. So I spent about 3 months justifying to myself of why it was so, how I was so right in being angry at my father. And then I realized that 1, I was very unhappy not talking to my dad. And 2, that when I had forgiven my dad, I hadn't made a decision that it was okay that he didn't have a job, but it was okay that he was human, that he was a person who wasn't going to be perfect, who was going to let me down, and I still wanted to love him. And that's what I hear when I look at the gospel reading. Not that as Christians we forgive by evaluating each episode and asking ourselves if we can live with it or not. But as Christians, we are called to accept humanity and its brokenness and its fragility and decide that in spite of that, we want to be in relationship with one another and we want to love one another. And so when we look at the actions of ISIS and we look at the violence in the world, what I am suggesting is that we can acknowledge as Christians the wrong that's being done, and we can maintain the stance that we want to believe that love can win out. We want to understand the humanity that's there, and we want to, instead of adopting an attitude of hate, continue in love. And because this is a very challenging action and a very challenging choice, I want to offer 2 suggestions of ways that we can begin doing that. And there are suggestions that are helpful to me. If they are helpful to you, I would love it if you took them up. If not, pray and discern and find your own way to find that stance of love. The first for me is by acknowledging that, in fact, I am the oppressor. That at some point in my life, I have needed forgiveness. That at some point in my life, I have denied someone the space to have the freedom of their religion, the freedom of their belief. That at some point in my life, I have needed someone to accept me as human and love me anyway. And the good news for all of us today is that we are loved. We are accepted. As the Bishop Mark Hollingsworth said yesterday, that in all of our humanity, God has chosen you. God has chosen me. God has chosen us to be his people, to be his light of love in the world. And from that place, I am capable of going out and offering that love to other people. And the second suggestion is to act. Right now, Congress is trying to decide how we engage with the violence of the Arab nations. And I really believe that the second and third point of President Obama's strategy to build up the capacity of Arab nations and to support troops on the ground is completely in line with what America could be doing to help. The lack of capacity in Kenya is the reason I had to leave. Over and over again, when I was in Kenya, I saw the need to build the capacity of the governments there to deal with challenge. And it's the same thing we're seeing in the Arab nations, as the Arab coalition, which is being formed right now, needs the strength to be able to address the challenges on the ground. So you can call congressmen and you can ask them to support building up the capacity of the Arab nations so that they can deal with the violence on the ground. And you can choose to act in love. Because what I have found is when we choose to act, love starts to take over. And sometimes as we act, love penetrates our hearts, and sooner rather than later we find the spirit of love abiding in us. So today I'm asking you to join me in acknowledging that that is horrendous and wrong what is happening. But because of the love of Christ, and because of the grace of his life, we have an ability to love in spite of that. So may God give us ears that hear his will and the courage to obey.